So when we start looking at the cost of food, the point here is this is somebody on the ground. This is somebody who deals with this on a daily basis, been doing it for more than 50 years. He literally has been doing this longer than many of the politicians or the economists have been doing this. And what he's saying is all the numbers are nonsense. There's no way in the next 90 days that the cost of food at that inflation measurement is only going to be 2.5%. Look at this. The cost to move it is exploding. It has literally gone from $500 to $25. That's a 5x increase on this chart since January of 2020. How is it possible that food prices only go up 2.5%? It's not possible. You have to be an absolute moron or you have to be lying in order to believe that if every single input to your business, from the cost of transportation to the ingredients used, explode upwards, but the cost of food is not going to do the same. And we're not talking about, oh, transportation went up 10% and therefore the cost of the goods only goes up 2%. 500% increase over the last 18 months in the cost of ocean freight. 500%. The cost of food is not up only 2.5%. We know Tyson Foods in Q1 of this year said that the average price of the food that they sell, it's a $30 billion food distribution company. The average price that they increased in Q1 was 7.5%. But the official numbers say 2.5%. But a $30 billion food distribution company says it was 7.5% in Q1. Something is not right. And this is why we continue to see absolute chaos when it comes to economics and the political arena, is because everyone is looking at data that is wrong. You can't make good decisions with bad data. So it's not just food, though. John, I love you. We may try to get John Katz on here because I feel like he'd have some great stories.
How much do you, real quick, how much do you think, so I pulled up some numbers here of what the average person spends on certain categories, right?
Okay.
So out of their paycheck. The average person spends 32% of their paycheck on housing or rent.
Yep.
They spend 16% on transportation, 13% on food, and 8% on healthcare. So like 60, 65, or 70%, 60 to 70% of their paycheck is spent on housing, transportation, food, and healthcare. The average person. So food, while it may seem like a small category to some people, it's certainly not to the average kind of worker.
How much was I'm looking real quick. What was the Chipotle price increase? This looks like this was in June of 14, that the menu price on common items is higher than any other Chipotle location in a major U.S. city.
Yeah, they hiked prices by 4%.
4% average increase. Yeah. So the average number, the CPI number for the food sector is telling you that it's 2.5%. But Chipotle raised theirs 4%. Tyson Foods raised theirs 7.5%. John Katz, the legend, the OG grocer of New York City, is telling you it's going to be 10 to 14%. Why is it that the official number is always lower than all of the other data points? Why is that? It's because the numbers are wrong. And we have people making decisions with data that are wrong. You can't make good decisions with bad data. So it's not just food, though. Let's look at Zillow. This recently came out from Zillow. Rent growth. Joe just described, what do you say, 30-something% of spending is in housing or rent?
Yeah, 36%.
Rent growth maintained widespread momentum in June, with the Zillow Observed Rent Index up almost 2% month over month. 2% month over month. Annualize that. Guess what that is, my friends? I'm not a mathematician. It's over 20% for the year. Year over year rent growth is up 7%. The largest annual increase in the series history, reaching all the way back to 2015. Rents have risen 5.1% since March. We're in July. It's not like we're a year later. We're in July. From March to July, 5.1% increase. It's the fastest quarterly growth in Zillow's data history. Hello, somebody sound the alarm. The official numbers are wrong. Zillow has the ground truth. Stop looking at the official numbers. Look at the ground truth. Rent growth maintained widespread momentum. You know what that code's for? Shit's going parabolic and nobody knows how to stop it. Because 1.8% month over month growth annualized is over 20%. If you look, just since March, is up 5% from March to the end of June, which means April, May, July. If you annualize it, it's about 20%. These people have lost their minds. We're talking about housing costs to rent a place, 20% annualized growth. absolutely nuts. Now, what do we do about it? That's the big question. And I've done my absolute best to highlight the problems and focus on the problems and try to just make sure people are awake and understand everything around you is getting more expensive. And it's not going to slow down anytime soon. But we've now officially reached absolute clown world when it comes to politicians. That's where we have reached, clown world. Because in the last 2 days, I've seen 2 separate videos on the internet that I can't help myself. I literally want to just ask myself, what are we doing? The first one came yesterday. AOC was talking to Don Lemon. And AOC made the claim that all of the growth in prices is due to supply chain issues. The thing that AOC gets right is that supply chain disruption due to COVID is true. That has happened. There is a lot of issues in the supply chains, and that has led to some impact on prices. AOC also continued to describe the fact that the prices of these assets are going to come down. She spoke about lumber prices being at all-time highs, even though they've crashed significantly in the last couple of weeks. So she's obviously operating with outdated data. They're not looking at the data on a day-to-day basis. On top of that, she completely negated to mention anything about fiscal and monetary stimulus. So everything is supply chain and COVID related, nothing about fiscal and monetary stimulus. And her solution was a $3+ trillion infrastructure package to build more ports. You cannot make this up. Literally, they want to spend trillions of more dollars in order to build more infrastructure because they believe that by creating more infrastructure, that will lead to prices correcting, inflation being temporary, and everything being okay. If I have to remind you, since the global financial crisis, there has been every single year a record amount of federal income tax collected in our country. The top line revenue from federal tax income has increased every single year. It's like a business making more in revenue every single year. But every single year as well, the inter-year, meaning for that year, deficit has widened and widened. The equivalent would be your business makes more top line revenue, but your losses are widening. It's the same thing that Wall Street says when they see a business saying, wait a second, their losses are deepening even though they continue to make more money. That's a bad business. That's what the federal government is doing for over a decade. And what we now have is we have AOC, who is, I believe, 31 years old and is no prior training in monetary, economic, or fiscal policy or anything, on national television explaining to people that it's the supply chain, that it's COVID. It has nothing to do with the fiscal and monetary policy that has affected them so much. On top of that, she continues to reference official numbers. She continues to present them as if they're fact, even though the very people who present that information to us has said they're inaccurate. The models are broken. Now, the one other thing that AOC got right is that she said, if we raise interest rates, there will be a negative impact on unemployment. Correct. And so if we go to raise the interest rates, she does not want to see that negative impact on unemployment, and she's advocating for depressed interest rates at 0% and continued spending. We do not have a spending problem in this country. Or I'm sorry, we do not have a revenue problem in this country. We have a spending problem. And if you look at what AOC was advocating for yesterday, it was in order to solve our problems, we need to spend more money. That is not the answer. To make it even worse, the day before, Joe Biden held a town hall. Now, Joe Biden is 78 years old, and he stood up there for an hour or so and took questions. It's actually a pretty incredible feat to stand there for an hour and be peppered with questions. I don't believe they know the questions in advance, but I could be wrong. I know there's people who think that they do. And at one point, he was asked from the audience about businesses and hiring people and kind of all this stuff. And the moderator followed up and basically said, well, what about all the fiscal and monetary policy? And Joe Biden, again, you cannot make this up, cited Moody's and said Moody's, which he described as a Wall Street firm, not a liberal think tank, has said that if he is able to get his infrastructure package passed and he is able to spend more money in that infrastructure package, that it will reduce inflation. That is correct. The president of the United States is claiming that if he spends more money, inflation will be reduced. Now, In order to appease people and claim to have some level of expertise, Joe Biden leveraged Moody's, which is about the worst person or group that you could have leveraged in that scenario. Because if we go back to 2008, Moody's rated the subprime mortgages at AAA. Moody's has paid almost $1 billion fine. They were fined for their actions in 2008 for rating the subprime mortgages AAA. So if we are going to count on Moody's to give any level of rating in terms of what inflation is or what you can do to reduce inflation, you are not a student of history. What you find is that we have a 78-year-old man and we have a 31-year-old woman. There's also the same thing happening on the other side of the aisle as well. This is not a Democrat versus Republican. This is across the aisle and with independents. This is across our political spectrum. Old people and young people and people in the middle are saying, I'm not an economic expert. That's what they're saying. And so what they're having to do is they're having to turn to experts like Moody's and others. The problem is that when we have politicians turning to experts that are then heavily influenced by the financial sector, by banks and other financial institutions, we get exactly what we're seeing. We get classic talking points of the wealthy and the rich who want depressed interest rates and want a continuation of monetary and fiscal stimulus in order to make themselves richer. Rich people benefit from this situation. When the cost of food increases, that is a direct correlation to the cost of stocks increasing as well. When AOC talks about supply chain issues, it doesn't account for why are stocks at an all-time high at the same time the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is at an all-time high. What does the supply chain have to do with that? Nothing. Now, the point in bringing up everything from the cost of food to rent to supply chain to the politicians is that this is a very, very complex issue. There is no one single boogeyman. You can't just point to fiscal policy, monetary policy, supply chain, etc. It's the totality of events that are rolled up that create the increase of the cost of living. But what we cannot do is also allow anyone, whether they are economists, financial incumbents, politicians, or anyone else, to also point at one single solution to a complex problem either. You can't simply just spend money on infrastructure and think that's the solution. You can't simply stop fiscal or monetary stimulus and think that's the solution. If you have a complex problem that has the totality of events that create it, you also have to have a solution that is complex, that has a totality of impact on the full problem. The problem is that that doesn't play well with the American people. You cannot have economists, central bankers, politicians, etc., simply go out and say, hey, this is a really hard problem. There is no one single solution. But that's what we have to get back to. We have to get back to some level of common sense that says, I don't care if you're on the right, the left, or down the middle. I don't care if you're old or young. I don't care if you're rich or poor. I don't care who you are, where you live, where you come from, how much money you have, who your parents are, what school you went to. What we know is that the data is overwhelming, that the cost of living is increasing in this country. And if we do not take a holistic approach on both a fiscal, monetary, and infrastructure standpoint, and we actually create a solution, the cost of living is only going to continue to go up. The bottom 45% of Americans are going to continue to go into a worse and worse financial position. And the top 55% of Americans who hold investable assets are going to get richer than they could have ever imagined. And so the only thing that you can do at home is you can't change fiscal policy, you can't change monetary policy, and you sure as hell ain't going to go build ports. But what you can do is you can make sure that you've got investments so that if the rich people get rich, you get rich too. Because what we are watching is a situation where the government and the central bank is going to make everyone who holds investments richer than they could have ever imagined. And so what you need to do, I don't care what you invest in, whether it's real estate, stocks, commodities, crypto, whatever, you have to make sure you're invested.